I've been in Detroit working off and on for the past 7 years. And my first professional exposure, if you will, to Detroit was while I was at SOM as an associate and senior planner. I had the pleasure of working very closely with Henry Cisneros and also David Hill of Kimball Hill Homes, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. And it was my first up-close interaction with Detroit and some of the issues that they were facing. Fast forward to just 9 months ago, shortly after Mayor Bing took office, I had the pleasure of meeting several of his staff members prior to a large press conference he was giving. And as I was being introduced by a gentleman by the name of Walt Watkins, who I'm sure you probably know, and you as well, the first question that three of the staff members asked was, this is once I explained or gave them my background, was, what is your experience in shrinking cities? And it's obviously a term that a number of us are familiar with, but it was interesting because I only thought of shrinking cities from the professional side as an architect and urban designer planner. But when I heard the question from the first to the second to the third time I heard it, all within the span of maybe 10 minutes, it was troubling to me. And for the first time, I was actually hearing it maybe as a resident or as a community member. And how would I feel about my city that is shrinking? And for the first time, I thought about what that really meant. The terms that have been out there, shrinking cities, condensing, right-sizing. What does that really mean? And I think we know that at the end of the day, it's really about population loss. But when you use those terms and you're talking to someone in the Far East Side neighborhood or in Brightmoor, it takes on quite a different meaning, which basically means, what does that mean for me? Will I be here? Will I be crossed out, if you will? And it's interesting because the mayor's actually started to back away from some of those terms, but at the same time, the message is very clear. Detroit has to rethink itself. We are not going to be a city of 1.8 million people. Right now, maybe 850, maybe 900. I think it's closer to probably, I think it's closer to 8 or less. But is there anything wrong with that? No. Is that okay? Yes. What does Detroit need to do today to actually reposition itself to become a more sustainable city, that it can sustain itself to the population it does have, but at the same time allow itself to have a framework to grow?
The reality is, and many public officials I know that have been facing this problem, including the mayor of my own hometown, who's a very bright guy, but he and others have said, I don't believe in this, quote, shrinking concept. Wrong word for sure. We got to come up. You got to invent a word because I can't find one. But it's how do we deal with cities that have had significant population loss and need to repattern the built environment in order to properly accommodate the population we really have? Turn that into a word.
Can't we talk to the people at a weight loss program?
Yeah,
Certainly
right.
they've
It
got
is a little bit like that.
A good
my point is
euphemism.
this. Many elected officials say, I'm not going to do this because I'm not going to tell residents that they won't receive services. Guess what? They're not receiving them now, your point. And so the real point is, how do we position the built environment in these cities such that the services that we actually can afford are delivered in the most efficient and highest quality fashion? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. The truth of the matter is, and this is where I think the work that Jay has been doing and the work that we've been doing in Flint with the development of land banks, I think is an important step because it makes this point. We have figured out in this country how, without force, to induce development. We did it for a long time, intentionally creating models to expand the built environment, to draw people from America's cities into America's suburbs, which are now becoming the next wave of abandonment. This didn't happen spontaneously, entirely. It happened because we designed systems, land use systems, infrastructure investment, tax policy that drew citizens and businesses and development and infrastructure out of America's cities and towns into suburbs that were completely unsustainable. So the point is, if we can come up with a design that is the desired design for cities, we can turn that machinery in reverse again, and we can use incentives, tools, inducements to get cities repatterned in such a way that they can be sustainable again. The notion should not be that this is a one-time fix, just like we had this one period of growth and now this one period of decline, and now we got to figure out how to deal with that reality. We need to understand, many Europeans do, understand that these cities will go through periods, cycles, long-term cycles of growth and decline. And the decisions that we make about this land should not preclude some future development, but shouldn't sentence the next generation to a waiting period of misery until cities are recognized as the important place they need to be. We need to be able to fix the problem now and not preclude some future growth, but not condition current quality of life on some hope or some wish or some prayer that someday soon people will come back to these places.
Well, in Youngstown, Ohio, again, I mean, you've heard the story just very briefly. Youngstown, Ohio was a steel city. It had the manufacturing prowess that helped build the infrastructure of this country, that helped win the wars. You know, it was never as large as Cleveland or Pittsburgh, but the manufacturing capacity rivaled those cities and to a certain extent exceeded those cities on certain measurements. At its peak, Youngstown, Ohio had about 180,000. That fell precipitously, and we find ourselves now at about 75 to 80,000. You're absolutely right. It was laid out to accommodate 250,000 people. But when the steel industry collapsed, it became a defining collapse or failure of the city of Youngstown, Ohio, and we existed that way for 25 or 30 years, literally grasping at straws, and the approach was, well, we've got to find something to replace that one industry. And that drove just a whole host of basically snake oil salesmen coming in, and really just the community would buy into anything. And the thing that still sticks out in my mind is the fact that there was a time where it was thought that the industry that was going to put Youngstown back on a map were going to be building airships, dirigibles. And this was after the Hindenburg disaster, that still people thought, well, you know, airships are going to be where the manufacturing base of Youngstown is built. I say all that to say that about 10 years ago, we had a community-wide epiphany. We went through a series of fits and starts of again, trying to find the easy fix and trying to wait around for someone in Washington, D.C. or Columbus, Ohio, where some industry owed us something because of the collapse of the steel industry. And it took a lot of soul searching. It took a lot of community discussion and dialogue. And I call it an epiphany because that's really what it was. We came together after a series of discussions in the community that started off with maybe 2 or 3 dozen people at a time, that ultimately culminated in 1,300 people coming together a week before Christmas in one of the city's historic public auditoriums to have a frank and candid discussion about what Youngstown was going to be. We talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And out of that night came 4 basic principles that started us on the road to be one of the first cities to actually acknowledge and embrace the fact that we were going to be smaller. And those 4 things were, first and foremost, accepting that we were going to be a smaller city, but understanding that that didn't mean we had to be inferior. Although the population numbers indicated that we were smaller, the thinking was such that we somehow have got to grow our way out of this. So instead of being a city of 150,000 or 130,000, we were going to be a great city of 75 or 80,000. Secondly, we had to understand and accept that the Youngstown's role in the regional and global economy was going to change. We over-relied on manufacturing, and while manufacturing is still a part of who we are and what we do, the notion that the world had changed around us and we hadn't changed and weren't ready to plug into those other economic industries had to be a driving fundamental part of who we were going to be moving forward. We had to deal with the image and quality of life. As I looked at that list of the top 10 most dangerous cities, I was pleasantly surprised that in that year Youngstown wasn't on there because for far too many years we have been. And while that is not a part of an economic or a land use planning, we had to make it part of our comprehensive vision and a comprehensive plan because those were real issues that impacted and affected whether people were going to choose to live in Youngstown, Ohio. And the 4th thing that night we had to realize was this had to be a call to action. It had to start in Youngstown. It had to start with the interaction of the people in Youngstown. the Mott Foundation and Richard Harwood, they did a study, and it was entitled Waiting for the Future, and it described Youngstown as a place, again, waiting for some outside stimulus to come and create a vision and create a plan and sort of lead us down the road of recovery, and that wasn't going to happen. It had to start with the people there. Not that there wasn't going to be interaction and involvement from the federal government or the state government or the private sector. All those were going to be important players, but the people of Youngstown just waited for decades for someone else to come and be a part of that. And in the intervening 10 years, and we started this, again, back in 2000, and the vision and the plan became known as Youngstown 2010. And part of that was to start forcing us to look at ourselves instead of looking in that rearview mirror, which we had done for 25 years and defined ourselves by the collapse of the steel industry and this declining population and all the other things, was to start looking at the city in 10-year increments. 10 years being long enough to start getting things done, but not so far out in the future where people couldn't see themselves as a part of that change. And while there's still a lot of work to be done, and by no means have we figured it out, and I don't know that we're in a position to be preaching or giving advice, we have certainly found ourselves much better off as a smaller city that is more economically diverse, again, that still has an unemployment rate that exceeds the state average, it still has a crime rate that is unacceptably high. However, a city that is no longer being defined solely by its problems. We're more so being defined by our response to these problems and challenges than we are the challenges and the problems themselves.
Kind of goes to conversations that Mayor Bing initiated. We have to come up with language so that we can have an honest conversation with folks in the neighborhoods that we're talking about. And the language really matters. This is sort of the notion about shrinking. The language matters. I used the term shrinking back in 2009 intentionally to provoke a conversation, and it worked. I had some of that same reaction. But there needs to be some leadership on this subject, and leadership sometimes means disappointing people, telling them truths that are hard to hear. We have to understand that we have to have some sensitivity to the language, number one. Second point, only last point I'll make on this point, is that we have to constantly remind ourselves that to create cities that are smaller, because the economy has changed so dramatically in these places, to create cities that are smaller means building them smaller. It's not subtraction that we're talking about entirely. It's investment. We have to invest in building the smaller place, which means significant resources going into creating vibrant neighborhoods. And so I think often we describe this as some sort of an acknowledgement of failure, and we have to sort of sweep up the mess that's left behind due to this dramatic change in our economy, when what we really need to present to neighbors is an investment strategy that says this is where we need to build neighborhoods that are the neighborhoods you imagined when you moved to this place in the first place. And then offer, as Jay has conceptualized, offer folks a chance to transfer if there is a need for folks to be relocated. Offer them a chance to transfer their sort of theoretical equity that they think they still have into one of those places that is the place that they imagined they were moving into in the first place.